President Bush addressed the nation last evening for the first time since declaring the end of major military operations in Iraq last May. Here is what he said.
2 years ago, I told the Congress and the country that the war on terror would be a lengthy war, a different kind of war, fought on many fronts in many places. Iraq is now the central front. Enemies of freedom are making a desperate stand there, and there they must be defeated. This will take time and require sacrifice. Yet we will do what is necessary. We will spend what is necessary to achieve this essential victory in the war on terror, to promote freedom, and to make our own nation more secure. We have conducted a thorough assessment of our military and reconstruction needs in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. I will soon submit to Congress a request for $87 billion. The request will cover ongoing military and intelligence operations in Iraq, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, which we expect will cost $66 billion over the next year.
Tonight, we assess the President's main points and consider some of the challenges of rebuilding Iraq. Joining me now from Boston is Joseph Nye, Dean of the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. His book is The Paradox of American Power. And here with me in New York are Max Boot, Senior Fellow in the National Security Studies Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book is The Savage Wars of Peace. Jeffrey Sachs, Director of Columbia University's Earth Institute, and also an advisor to governments in Latin America, Eastern Europe, Asia, Africa, and also the United Nations. And Shashi Tharoor, Undersecretary General for Communications and Public Information at the United Nations. Also a novelist, but we're not going to discuss that this evening. Let me start with you, Joseph Nye. What do you make of the President's claim that Iraq is now the central front in the war on terror?
Well, I think wrapping Iraq into the war on terror requires a connection between what happened on September 11th and Saddam Hussein or Iraq, and that's not yet proven. So, in an analytical point of view, I don't think it fits very well. From a political point of view, it fits very well. If you want to get broad public support for the situation in Iraq, trying to connect it to 9/11, as the President did in that form, is a very good idea. In fact, public opinion polls show that more than half of the American public think that Iraq was connected to 9/11. So politically it's worked, though analytically I don't think it holds water.
But right now, isn't it the case that there are elements of al-Qaeda trying to kill Americans in Iraq?
Oh yeah, what we've done is we've essentially made Iraq the center of a war on terrorism, but that doesn't mean that originally it was. Max,
what do you think?
I think there's something to what Joe Nye is saying, but it's not such a bad idea to my mind to have al-Qaeda attacking 130,000 heavily armed American troops rather than focusing their efforts upon American civilians on the home front. There is no question, if you read some of the interesting reporting that's been done in the Washington Post and elsewhere, that this is becoming a focus of the global jihadist terrorist network. And I think our troops on the ground in Iraq are well positioned to deal with this threat. They are dealing with it, and they will continue to deal with it. So I think it's a smart strategy, but it's not going to pay an immediate dividend. We're not going to win this war in 3 weeks as we won the initial war in Iraq. It's going to be a longer-term struggle, but one that I believe will be successful.
Jeff, the Central Front?
Well, I think we've put ourselves in harm's way, without any good reason, and I don't think we're going to have an easy time getting out, it seems. The President's digging in deeper. He's going to waste a lot of lives and a lot of money for reasons that remain opaque, obscure, and perhaps non-existent.
Max, you're just back from Iraq. What do you make of the analogy some are making in the media, that this is, in some ways, shades of Vietnam?
I think there is a Vietnam analogy, Fareed, but I don't think it's the one that you most commonly hear. The one you hear is that this is turning into another unwinnable quagmire, as Vietnam supposedly was. In reality, if you look at what happened in Vietnam after 1968, after the Tet Offensive, the United States Armed Forces won a tremendous victory. They defeated the Viet Cong by 1970. Over 95% of the South Vietnamese countryside was under the control of Saigon. But none of that mattered, because in 1968 at Tet, we lost a public relations battle. Even though we were winning the war on the ground. We lost the war in the hearts and minds of Americans. And I'm afraid that something similar might be happening in Iraq. Because if you go to Iraq and you actually see what's going on in places like Najaf or Karbala or Mosul and talk with our troops and talk with the Iraqis, you'll see a tremendous amount of progress being made. We are doing very well on the ground there. We're making a lot of progress in a lot of areas, and there's very good relations between the people and the American troops in most of Iraq. But that's not the message you get through on the home front. On the home front, all you read about or see reports on the news, in the TV about, are disasters. You hear about the terrorism, you hear about the crime, you hear about all the things that are going wrong, and there's no question they are. But there's another side to the story, and so I'm concerned that even as we're winning the battle on the ground, we might be losing the propaganda war at home.
Joe Nye, what do you make of that?
Well, I think the Vietnam analogy is very imperfect. The situation that we're facing in Iraq is quite different. I think the true issue that we face now is how do we develop a broad international support for our position, the broad international support that we didn't develop before we went in. I think our ability to actually stabilize Iraq and to produce a better Iraq depends upon that broadening of support. Last week, Secretary of State Powell said that we were moving in that direction, but we're not quite there yet.
What would it get us? What would this broad international support get us on the ground that you think is important?
Well, it gets you two things, legitimacy and money. It gets you troops also, in terms of the support that we get from having other forces in there. So I think all those things are useful for keeping us there. But I think it also feeds back into what Max said about American opinion at home. I think the American public is not well suited for empire. I think they're better suited for working on things as part of an international community. And I think there's going to be greater potential for sustaining the American position in Iraq if we do it with the help of others than if we try to do it alone.
Shashi, the president has now asked for the support of other countries, gone back to the United Nations. Is there much rejoicing at the United Nations about all this?
No, I don't think really that this is an occasion for a lot of schadenfreude, sort of relishing the Americans coming back. I think on the other hand, people felt for a while that the United Nations had been set aside, and they're pleased that the issue is back in the Security Council in a constructive way. But no one is interested in refighting the battles that divided the Council earlier in the year. We want to look forward, and the impression I get from pretty much all the members of the Security Council is that they have really taken this in a constructive spirit. There have been statements of welcome for the President's address out of a number of capitals, and people are looking very hard at the resolution. I do want to add one thing to what Joe said, and I agree with Joe's analysis, but I would say the important element is not internationalization just for legitimacy and troops or any other resources. It's also got to be a change of framework. That is, internationalization should permit the world to move away from a sort of logic of occupation by military conquest, which is what we have right now, into a different framework that essentially creates a UN-mandated international presence. It would be the same American soldiers. They'd simply be wearing, as it were, a different metaphorical hat, but with a view to returning Iraq to the Iraqi people. So the resolution that's being discussed, and this is what many member states are anxious to see, should transform the nature of the occupation into something different, something that enshrines ideally a timetable or at least a very clear-cut transitional role for the military and the political presence in Iraq, so that ultimately we can get Iraq back into the hands of the Iraqi people.
Well, ironically, I don't see much sign that the UN is transitioning Kosovo or Bosnia towards self-rule of the people. I think it's generally doing a good job there, but I'm not sure that's what it's done in the past. Now,
we're out of Bosnia as of December last year, so I'd say
well,
that we've
you're
done that
certainly not out of Kosovo, but I mean, the larger point is I'm in favor of getting another UN resolution. I think it makes tactical sense, as Joe and I said, to get more troops, to get more money. But I think we're fooling ourselves if we think it's going to provide more quote-unquote legitimacy for the occupation in the eyes of the Iraqi people. Because, for example, one person I talked to in one of the southern Shiite cities of Iraq, as they put it to me, the UN was opposed to our liberation. They didn't want it to free us from Saddam Hussein, so why would we rejoice to have the UN here? I think that's a widespread perception in Iraq that the UN has to deal with.
Well, First of all, on Kosovo, I should say the big difference is there is no agreed end state. No one knows. Kosovo started off as a province of Serbia when the NATO bombing occurred. What is it now? What is it going to be? No one has agreed on this, and therefore
but Shashi, I think
but Iraq, we all agree.
But Max's point is that the UN has, when it has been involved in other societies, not had a haste towards self-rule. It has tried to do it in an orderly fashion, whether in East Timor, whether in Bosnia after several years, right?
East Timor, we did this whole thing in 2 years,
right.
And the Timorese don't want us to leave. I mean, the government, the independent,
but we're now 5 months
government,
into Iraq, so...
Exactly. And the point I think that's worth making about Max's point, first of all, we all agree on the end state. No one is challenging the fact that Iraq is a sovereign, independent country that must remain such. And the idea of getting towards a democratic, independent, sovereign Iraq with the Iraqis in control of their own destiny, that's fine. What's essentially, I think, what we have to focus on in terms of the UN involvement is not, I think, Max, the worry about whether the UN will stay too long or do whatever. It's how do we use the UN? The UN, in this case, is a forum where 15 countries in the Security Council can agree upon the framework within which this operation is to be conducted. I don't think anyone is trying to change the nature of the operation. It's going to be US soldiers. That will not change. It's going to be a US commander. He would simply be a US commander with a different mandate. But what we're trying to accomplish here, it seems to me, is to broaden the basis for what's going on. As Joe said, the legitimacy that comes from the entire world saying, okay, we now take something that you essentially acquired through force of arms and give it instead the legitimacy of the force of law.
So if you got that, would there be troops forthcoming, you think, from
I believe if the resolution had the right language, other countries would be more willing to participate. And what's more, the participation of other countries and other troops will improve security as well.
Max, you argue in a piece I saw that you actually don't think we need more troops in Iraq.
I'm not sure that we do, although I do think it was a mistake to bring the Marines home, which just happened, where we had over 10,000 Marines in southern Iraq who were doing a tremendous job, and I might add, had not suffered a single combat death since May 1, in a period when we've lost 70 Army soldiers. Not a single Marine was killed. So they were doing an excellent job and also protecting themselves and having good relations with the populace, and they've been now replaced by a multinational force that's led by Polish, Ukrainian, Spanish troops and so forth, all of whom I'm sure are good troops, but it's going to take a while for them to get up to speed. As the Marines already were, it's going to be a learning curve for them to figure out the politics and the reality of local life in Iraq. So I think it was a mistake to bring those Marines home, but I'm not sure that we need a lot of other troops, extra troops being sent into Iraq. I think we have to be careful not to repeat the mistake of Vietnam, which was Americanizing the war too much, flooding the country with American troops. We have to realize the long-term solution, as was just pointed out, is really self-rule for the Iraqi people, and that means also having the Iraqi people take care of their own security problems and training a police force, an army, a constabulary that can deal with these problems, which is now happening.
Jeff Sachs, you have dealt with a number of countries going through or just after very terrible conflicts, civil wars, wars. What does it take to get stability, order, and then prosperity in these kinds of places? Is it something that can be done in a few months?
I don't think that the U.S. as an occupying army can do it. And I think we're going to continue to see a lot of instability. Maybe a UN mandate will make a difference, but only if it's part of a clear-cut timetable to return sovereignty quickly to Iraq. As long as the U.S. is an occupying army, I would guess even with a new UN mandate, although I don't know whether one would come under those circumstances, we're going to see a tremendous amount of violence and instability. There's just no perceived legitimacy for the U.S. to be there. The world was against this. It's not going to change the ability of any number of forces to continue to take very violent pot shots, killing Americans at will, and everyone else seeming to be associated with the Americans is going to remain. So I think the first step of real reconstruction is American withdrawal, to be replaced by a very short UN mandate on the way to Iraqi sovereignty. If we drag it out, if we think that just covering a U.S. occupation with some small numbers of soldiers around it is going to make a difference, I'd be skeptical. And I'd say to Max, it's a little bit late to start talking about not Americanizing this war. This is an American war, whether you like it or not. There isn't anyone in the world outside of this country that doesn't see this as a wholly bought, purchased, owned American war and occupation.
Can I just take issue with one point that you made, which is that the occupation is unpopular because it's run by American troops? That is not at all what I found. To be sure, there's a minority of the population which does not like the occupation, and a very small minority of that which is violent and expressing its antipathy, mainly having to do with the old Baathists, the new jihadis who are coming in. There's a violent fringe to that society. But I don't see any sign that reflects the popular sentiment of the people of Iraq. When you drive around Iraq in a U.S. Marine or Army vehicle, as I did, people wave to you, they smile, they're glad to have you there. That's not universally true. Certainly in the Sunni triangle above Baghdad and Tikrit, there is a much more hostile populace. But in 2/3 or more of the country, the people welcome the Americans. And when you talk to the troops, they have a lot of positive contacts with the Iraqis, and they get a lot of help from the Iraqis. Most of the intelligence information upon which they base their raids and other actions comes from Iraqi volunteers who just come to them and say, hey, we know there's this Baathist hiding out here. Why don't you go search his house? So I think it is not that we are lacking popular support in Iraq. The problem is there's a small, diehard core of former Baathists and new jihadi terrorists who are able to operate with a lot of funds, a lot of weapons, and a small core of these former people who are in the regime. That's what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with a widespread insurgency. It's not even, it's not a tenth the size of what we were dealing with in a place like Vietnam.
Jeff? Well, I don't know what you count fringe, core, how you do this majority, minority, but there is a large enough element and violent enough that it's going to continue to destabilize the country. You don't blow up pipelines by majority vote. That's not the point. You have enough people that are able to operate to blow up pipelines, and they can destroy this country and keep destroying it. And they will find enough support locally to be able to do that, I fear, until the U.S. is out and there's an Iraqi sovereign government. So, you know, it's not this isn't a popularity contest. It's the ability to affect governance, and I don't think we have it.
Well, there is a sovereign government in Afghanistan right now, Hamid Karzai, and you don't see a marked decrease in attacks by the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The point is, you're dealing with a small hardcore of desperate terrorists who don't want democracy in Iraq. They're not going to be satisfied if we establish democracy. That's the last thing they want. They would attack any democratic government as much as they're attacking the U.S. occupation authorities right now.
Shashi, based on the UN's experience in Kosovo, in Bosnia, in East Timor, is it realistic to speed up the timetable, even if it's desirable from a political point of view, because you want to change the logic of occupation, as you say? What if you end up moving from the logic of occupation to the logic of chaos?
That's a very good question, and in fact, Joe's right, it will take time. But you still have to look at the framework within which that time is going to be spent. As I said, if you look at Timor-Leste, as East Timor is now known, we essentially ran the place for a couple of years, helped create self-governing institutions, elected a president, a constitutional assembly, parliament, handed over, and the government still said, stay on a bit. We still need you to help maintain security, to help us get struggling to our feet and get running before we can start running. And indeed, the UN is still there. And we're not even sure that we will be able to leave on schedule in the middle of next year. So there is a question of whether, in terms of judging a long-term Iraqi development, you might want to think in terms of continuing to assist a sovereign independent government of Iraq through external assistance, including perhaps security assistance, even after they have resumed their sovereignty. But what we have to ask ourselves fundamentally is, what do the Iraqi people want? Right now we don't have an answer to that question, and we're not even sure we yet have fully representative institutions with full credibility amongst the Iraqi people who can tell the world what the Iraqi people want. So that's why we'd like to head in that direction. You know, we have a governing council, they've just appointed a cabinet. There's a constitutional commission that's going to try and draw up a timetable for setting up a constitution. What the Secretary General of the UN has been suggesting is, let's accelerate some of these things so that you actually are able to move politically more rapidly towards letting Iraqis control their own political destinies and their own economic destinies. That doesn't mean that the world has to cut and run. That doesn't mean that the world has to pull out. But it does mean that the Iraqis, and ideally it should be elected Iraqis, would be the ones deciding how long the rest of us stay, and not us staying because we went in by force and are determined to stay as long as we think is right.
So the model, as I understand it, is that some kind of Iraqi authority would then need to ask the United Nations or the United States to stay on, because if it actually needs to accomplish goals relating to security or rebuilding or setting up a central bank, it will need external help.
It's entirely appropriate for a post-conflict situation, and particularly in this case, a country that has been ravaged in many ways, including before the conflict, through the years of the dictatorship. It's entirely appropriate for that country to say, look, we need help standing on our feet. We need help from the international community. It's a different question if the international community says, we're here and we're in charge of your country. That's always going to be resented by some.
Or if one country says it.
Well, let's be realistic here. I think that in Iraq already we have more progress towards self-government than we've had in Bosnia or in Kosovo after much longer periods of time. If you go around Iraq, every province has an Iraqi governor. Many of the cities have Iraqi mayors, Iraqi city councils. They've been elected in some cases, selected in most cases, but there is a definite attempt to put an Iraqi face on the government, and that's happening. And I'm sure that Paul Bremer and the rest of the occupation authorities would love nothing better than to cede more power as quickly as possible to the Iraqis. But the problem we run up against is the one that our host has written about, which is that you don't want to have a democracy which has the form of a liberal country but doesn't have the substance of it. And you can't just say, oh, we have an election so we can go home. You have to establish the institutions, the rule of law, the free press, all these other guarantees that are vital to guaranteeing Iraq's long-term security. And that can't be done in 5 months.
It seems to me, Jeff, you're in a sense writing off Iraq. You're saying you don't really think that it could succeed under any circumstances, so why waste the money?
Oh, I didn't say that at all. I said that having 150,000 American troops in there is irrelevant to its success, probably harmful. You cut the number of troops substantially, you make a clear timetable, sure, it has a chance of success, but the fact of American occupation doesn't raise the chance of success, it lowers the chance of success. And it lowers the chance of success at tremendous cost to this country and tremendous cost to all the other values and interests that we might be pursuing if we weren't spending $87 billion next year in this occupation. Why are we spending $87 billion for Iraq and $200 million for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria? 8 million people will die of these pandemic diseases, and the United States finds itself offering $200 million for those 8 million that are dying right now, and $87 billion because somehow this has become the most important thing in the world on the basis of absolutely zero evidence that it's important at all for us or that what we're doing there is beneficial. So I'm not writing off anything. What I'm writing off is accept the value of an American occupation at the cost of $87 billion for reasons that are opaque and absolutely inexplicable according to the reasons that have been given to us.
You could have said the same thing about World War II. Why are we spending all this money fighting Germany and Japan instead of dealing with disease and poverty in Africa? The reason is because we're in a war, and right now we are in a war that was declared probably more than a decade ago, and that came to our shores on 9/11. And I completely agree with the point that Joe and I made. Whatever you might think about the merits of going into Iraq, to cut out now, to cut and run after we've suffered some casualties would be disastrous. It would be to reinforce the message of Vietnam, of Beirut, of Somalia, that America is a paper tiger, as Osama bin Laden said, and that we can be attacked with impunity. And that would come back to haunt us in a very short period of time.
We weren't attacked with impunity. And Max, if you believe that World War II and our attack on Iraq are the same thing, then we're just seeing the world in unbridgeably different terms. Because,
we lost more people on 9/11 than we did on December 7th, 1941.
Yes, but Saddam Hussein did not attack us on 9/11.
Joe, does this price
So what's
tag?
the point?
Joe, does this price tag seem a little high for you? $87 billion.
Yeah, I think it is high, and it's also rather ironic when we were told by some members of the administration that Iraq would pay for its own reconstruction, that the oil would cover the costs, that we'd only be there for 3 months and so forth. When the president finally came out last night with that price tag, I think it was there was a bit of sticker shock for a lot of people. On the other hand, I think we are back to this point that the only way you can get that right price tag down is through internationalization. You get legitimacy and you get resources. But even if you can get that price tag down, you're not going to be able to escape a significant price. We're going to still have to pay a large share of it. The alternative is to leave before you have a stable Iraq, and I think if you have a chaotic Iraq or a return to dictatorship in Iraq, that's an even worse outcome.
And just to briefly answer the question that Jeff Sachs raised, I'm not claiming there's a connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11, but clearly I think we can all agree that right now Iraq has become the #1 front in the war on terrorism for whatever reason, and if we left now it would be seen as a major victory for al-Qaeda and the jihadis and all the people who want to destroy us.
If we want to fight al-Qaeda, I'm interested in fighting al-Qaeda. Stationing 150,000 troops in Iraq strikes me as a preposterous way to go about that business.
Let me ask Shashi Tharoor about the issue of legitimacy. So if the United States goes to the UN and passes a resolution, is it the case that the United Nations will provide an umbrella under which countries like India, Turkey, Russia, France, Germany, Pakistan will provide troops? Because unless those countries are going to do so, you will not get up to the numbers necessary. And will the European Union and Japan provide the money? Because unless they do, you won't get the funds that will make a dent in that $87 billion.
Well, Furi, the difficulty in answering that question is, first, of course, we don't know what the final shape of the resolution is going to be. There's a text that is clearly being discussed. Amendments have been proposed. There's a consultative process going on. This is like any other legislative body where a piece of legislation is being hammered out. And so we don't know whether the language that comes out, the language that the members of the Council finally agree on, will give you the result that you've just asked about. Second, the determination will be made by each individual country. You rattled off a list of countries. Each of them may have a slightly different threshold for what they need to give them the political and legal cover in their own domestic politics before they agree to participate. And I'm not sure that a language that says acceptable to France or Russia will necessarily be enough for India or Pakistan. We don't know, and it depends on what comes out of it. I have no doubt that US diplomats are busy fanning the globe and speaking to people in all these capitals and speaking to ambassadors of various countries in New York to try and see that their interests and concerns are satisfied with whatever comes out of the resolution. But until it's adopted, we don't know. If language is adopted that governments are all satisfied with, yes, you could have people being able to turn to their countries and saying, look, we're no longer just sending troops to support an American occupation. We are now making a contribution on the basis of a UN Security Council resolution to help an internationally mandated force transition this present situation into a return of Iraqi sovereignty. And that may be enough for these countries in terms of their own domestic politics. But we will not know that today.
Yeah. Nobody picked up on my question to them about why we're spending $87 billion in Iraq and $200 million when millions of people are dying of preventable and treatable diseases, but they're too poor to get the prevention and treatment. Is that right, Max?
I thought I answered that. We're at war. It was not a war of our choosing.
Do we have enough to save 8 million people?
We can't save every single person in the world who might die.
Can we do more than 200 million?
Jeff,
for
the duty of the United States government is not to save every single person in every poor country in the world. I think we ought to do as much as we can afford to do. But the number one duty of the United States government is to protect and defend the United States. And clearly, when we are at war with terrorists, when we are facing major attacks by elements of al-Qaeda, Ba'athist, other jihadis in a place like Iraq, we have to win that war right now, and that is the #1 priority of the United States government, as it should be.
Okay, you get one more on this, Jeff, and then we're going to move on.
It's just extraordinary. We were not being attacked by Baathists and al-Qaeda in Iraq till we launched a war there and spent $150 billion over an 18 to 24 month period, and then we put ourselves in the middle of a shooting gallery, and then you say we have to stay there because we're in the middle of a shooting gallery. This is a great way to run a country.
Well, you don't seem to care very much about the people of Iraq, Jeff Sachs, because you would have left them under the tyranny of Saddam Hussein, which would have been a pretty terrible place for them to be, and a lot worse than they are now.
You know, I see that.
All right, I think we're going to have to move from Crossfire back to the Charlie Rose Show for a second. Joe Nye, I want to get a sense from you. What would the diplomatic deal look like if we were to actually get internationalization? Surely these countries are going to ask for something. The president began by, in effect, saying, we want your help. We want to maintain the same policies we have, but we'd love for you to pay for them and contribute troops. That's not going to work. The French and the Germans have already made clear they want some kind of effective share in the political authority in Iraq. So what's the deal going to look like? What will we have to give in order to get troops and money?
I think that we're going to have to give up a degree of control on the political side, the area that Jerry Bremer is in control of. On the military side, though, I think that there are a variety of ways of merging a chain of command where you'd still have American military control. General Abizaid has said that there are a variety of ways of being creative here. We've seen it happen before in Bosnia, elsewhere. So I think that you will have a framework which legitimizes an American military presence, which I think is essential for the security. But I think the price that the United States will have to pay is to give up a good deal of the political control which we now exercise.
Meaning that Paul Bremer would be a UN official, or that there would have to be a separate person entirely?
Well, he could be deputized in some ways. There have been examples of that in the past. But I think you're going to see more real control going to other countries, not just a fig leaf.
And I have to say, Fried, I think that's not a bad idea, because one of the things that I picked up while I was in Iraq is that the Coalition Provisional Authority is not doing a tremendous job outside of Baghdad. They're trying to centralize everything. They're not doing a very good job of getting out into the provinces. And some of the military folks I talked to joke that the initials stand for can't provide anything, because the CPA is not doing very much. It's not getting a TV station out. It's flubbing a lot of the projects it's undertaking. So from that standpoint, it wouldn't be a bad thing to get some other people involved in running the political side of things, because I think that does need to be beefed up, and it could use more expertise. And the CPA right now has a lot of trouble attracting qualified people who are willing to stay for more than 3 months.
Shashi, do you worry that the United Nations being placed in this very difficult situation where security is still not entirely in place is being set up for a certain kind of failure? And you already hear the drumbeat of certain right-wing critics saying the last thing in the world one should do is hand this over to the UN. I think I've read the word feckless in the last few days more often than in a while. Are you worried that the United Nations will find itself in a situation where it can't function, and then the blame will be placed on them? People will say, you see, we turned it over to the UN and it all collapsed.
Right, well, we certainly don't want to be feckless, and we don't want to be reckless either. The fact is that we've suffered a great loss on the 19th of August, where we lost 22 people who were there really to do their best to help this process work. As far as we're concerned, it's essential that security conditions be such that it's worth it for UN officials to go out there and try and make a difference. And there's an awful lot that we are doing right now, from food to electricity repair, essentially providing life-saving rations, assisting with education. There's a whole series of activities which involve us getting out and working directly with the Iraqi people. If our people don't feel safe doing that, then we cannot responsibly send them there. Equally, the kind of work the UN has been traditionally tasked with doing cannot be performed behind tanks and sandbags. So we have to strike a balance, and the overall responsibility for the security environment within which we're working has to lie with those who are in control of the country. The CPA, as Max mentioned, and really the forces on the ground. That has to change, and I've got to be very, very clear about that. The UN does not want to let down the people of Iraq. We certainly want to fulfill the ideals for which our colleagues laid down their lives. But we don't want to have more colleagues risk their lives unless we can enable them to go in there feeling that they'll be safe enough to do the kinds of things that are actually useful enough to do, and that will help them make a difference for the Iraqi people. That is fundamental. And that's why the political and the security issues all go together. You're talking about a political resolution in the Council. It's got to be one that also enhances the security, so we cannot go out there and work.
But how would you address Jeff Sachs's point? The UN, after all, is also going to take this on as one of its largest projects, probably the largest project that the UN will do if it takes on Iraq. Is it worth it for the United Nations to be that involved in this one country?
Well, I certainly don't think we'll be taking it on in quite the same way as you mentioned. In other words, if it were a UN Blue Helmet operation with the budget being charged to the UN members, that would be quite a colossal charge, and I don't think they'd bear it. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a multinational force where the countries participating will have to find non-UN ways of financing their participation.
But the energy and attention of the United Nations will be focused on Iraq almost to the exclusion of other things
No, it
for a
can't
while.
afford to be to the exclusion of other things. I mean, I agree with Jeff's concern about AIDS and so on. I mean, let's face it, even throughout this year, the tragic combination of poverty and drought and famine and AIDS in parts of Africa has threatened more human lives than Iraq ever did. And from the point of view of the UN, our responsibilities are global. I take Max's point about the responsibility of the US government. We have to think worldwide.
So then why don't you say to the U.S. government, we're sorry, this is not one we can do something
It's something that we can do as part of a global agenda where we'll be doing other things too. We will not do it to the exclusion of everything else. When you speak in terms of the kinds of resources that are required, those resources come to us from member states. And we would not want member states to be giving us those resources at the expense of the other activities the UN is involved in around the world. This will have to be additional money, and indeed, you yourself asked the question, will the European Union, will Japan and others consider it? My impression so far is they are considering contributions, but nothing remotely like the kind of figure that they've heard out of the president last night. So we're going to have to see how all of this evolves.
And it's already happening here in the United States. You go to the Congress and they tell you, no, there is no money for anything else in the world right now. We have the budget deficit biggest in our history. This president has spent and cut taxes and done everything with abandon, and now $87 billion for Iraq. And no, there is no more than 200 million. So sorry for those 8 million people dying. You know, we're not really interested in them, and there's nothing that we can do for all of the other hot spots in the world and all the other people that are in desperate need, because we have to put in $150 billion into this country of 23 million people, and the 3 billion people that are in vastly worse condition, they should be damned.
Let me ask you about the economic effect of 150 billion. Let's assume over a couple of years that's the figure. Do you think the president should repeal the tax cuts in order to pay for this?
Well, I think the president should repeal the tax cuts, period, because we have deficits as far as the eye can see of trillions of dollars. So it's not just not paying for this, we're not paying for anything right now. The swing that we've had in the last few years, where 10 years of bipartisan excruciating effort to get back to fiscal responsibility was given up basically in a wanton and reckless fiscal policy. That would be true even without these incredible expenses. But you add in the fact that we've raised military spending by about $150 billion a year, or possibly even more, from a couple of years ago, then there's no doubt. Let's see how much the American people want to ask when we ask them to do the slightest sacrifice now, rather than hiding it all for what they're going to pay in a few years, but don't know it right now.
Let's put our military spending into some perspective here. Even though we are spending a lot of money in absolute terms, as a percentage of our economy, it's very small. It's only about 3.5% of our gross domestic product, a very small amount, about half of what we were spending on a percentage basis during the Cold War, and a small fraction of
4.5%.
Even at 4.5%, we were still spending about 7 to 8% during most years of the Cold War. The reality is it's a very small percentage of our economy, and one that we can readily afford because we are at war. Personally, I think we need to be spending more, and I think that President Bush has been wrong in not asking for an increase in the size of the military, because given all of our commitments around the world, I don't think we can man them all with only 10 active duty Army divisions. I think we need at least 1 or 2
and
more.
Should we pay for that, or
yes,
we don't pay for anything anymore?
Yes,
should we pay for it through a budget with the taxes to pay for our common defense, or have we forgotten all of those principles?
I'll make a deal with you, Jeff. I'll agree to the repeal of the tax cuts if you and other Democrats agree not to saddle us with a giant Medicare entitlement for prescription drugs, which will cost many times more than the tax cut. I think that in both cases, both parties are being fiscally irresponsible and neglecting our vital national defense.
Joe Nye, let me ask you if you feel that when FDR waged World War II, he cut domestic spending. When Truman waged the Korean War, he cut domestic spending. Lyndon Johnson waged the Vietnam War, both raising military spending and not raising taxes. Are we on a Lyndon Johnson path here?
Well, I think both Max and Jeff have a point. Basically, if you look at military expenditure as a percent of GNP, it is low by the historical standards of the Cold War. I think it got up to 9% in the last Eisenhower years. But to give away the tax base with tax cuts when you're facing this type of situation makes no sense at all. And you can't keep giving away the tax base and at the same time spend what you need to do on security and be able to have the other things that you're supposed to do. So I think what we're facing as a people right now is this is a case where the Vietnam analogy may have some relevance, which is Johnson didn't want to have the American public face the prospect that they gave up some of the particular aspects of the domestic policies which he had promised them, but he did want to spend more on the war. And I think that was a failure of leadership.
On that note, we're going to have to close this discussion. Thank you, Joseph Nye, Jeffrey Sachs, Shashi Tharoor, Max Boot. We'll be right back.
And we're going to add some commentary to this. So this was a September 2003 Charlie Rose show. Now, I don't know why Charlie Rose didn't host it. Could have been his night off. And it's with Max Boot, who I think is conservative, and John Nye, who I'm not familiar with. But then most interestingly, it was with Jeffrey Sachs and Shashi Tharoor. I'm working on pronouncing the name right. Now, the video I just did a little while ago, 1396, I was talking quite loudly. I was mad. People should be mad. The United States has had 1 million opioid overdose deaths in the last, 14 years. And we are having between 100 to 120,000 fatal drug overdose deaths per year now in the United States. Mostly people under the age of 40, 45 and under, some as young as age 1. 120,000 deaths a year, whereas our baseline, bad as it was 18,500 a year back in the year 1999. Having 5 times as many or 6 times as many people die per year of that is a demographic catastrophe for the United States of America. For the last several years, 1 out of every 30 deaths, all ages, all reasons, has been a drug overdose death. But when you factor out that most deaths are actually overall of 3 million a year, approximately are people who have already reached some semblance of old age. This would mean that for people that are being born today in the United States of America, if nothing were to change, the odds of any one child dying before old age of a drug overdose, fatal drug overdose, non-related to hospitals, is closer to 1 in 15 to 1 in 17. I don't know how much worse it needs to get before people start putting it at the top of the list. And some cop-out that it's because of drug running is bull. And some cop-out that it's because of the Jews and Purdue Pharma is bull. And some cop-out that it's because of pharma profits is bull. It's not about money. And it's not about depopulation, and it's not about the CIA, and it's not about Freemasons or Mormons or pyramids or whatever. This is a war on the United States of America. Americans can be killed in combat. They can be killed with bombs, and they can be killed with infiltration. They can also be killed with infiltration or by Americans who are more motivated by a godless world where they believe that sometimes it's necessary to kill young people in order to create the data to suggest we have a deadly novel virus running around, for example. Anyways, why do I bring that up, that catastrophic number? I bring it up because one person in this video, Jeffrey Sachs, let's see here, we have a lot of video of Jeffrey Sachs, who is definitely talking a lot in this video. And I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes or so reviewing some of this content here. There he is. Okay, there's Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs has been one of the most loudest voices during COVID-19. He is the most invited guest speaker at the Vatican. Jeffrey Sachs says deplorable things about the United States of America. Jeffrey Sachs here is saying that why should we be spending $84 billion on a war in Iraq, and the United States, can't spend $200 million to save 8 million lives or something like that from malaria and a few other things. Look, if it really was that simple, and if there really were going to be that many lives saved with certainty, he's got a point. We can find an extra $200 million here. We could have found an extra $200 million back then. But this isn't about that. He's saying that number, but it's really a disgust that money's being spent on the military. the military, as Max Boot is pointing out, was going into September 11th, 2001 at its lowest funding in 60, 80 years. And it was still, even though they got a funding boost, still near its all-time low. And it was only recently going up. And they're disgusted because they want the money spent on pharma. They want it spent, not pharma, they want it spent on genetics and genomics and data collection. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, this is a 2003 video, mind you, 20-something years later, in 2023, 2024, Jeffrey Sachs uses drug overdose deaths in the United States of America. He uses the data for them to say we had a deadly novel virus and we needed more vaccines. Jeffrey Sachs, as an American, is one of the worst traitors in the nation. Jeffrey Sachs lies about why people die. Jeffrey Sachs is worse than any of the traitorous Americans that George Washington treated by giving them one last walk to the woods where they were shot and then left to be eaten by the animals. Unfortunately, today, we don't do that with traitors in the United States of America. People are dead because of Jeffrey Sachs. He is a traitorous, murderous bastard who has no right to live in the United States anymore. Another thing about Jeffrey Sachs is that his wife's, the most frequent co-author of his wife, is Peter Hotez. You know, Peter Hotez of Baylor. Peter Hotez, the man who does child vaccines. Peter Hotez and Jeffrey Sachs have been on the Charlie Rose together at least once. Peter Hotez got to speak to the Vatican thanks to Jeffrey Sachs. Peter Hotez has also been collaborating with, oh, that's right, this Indian man who was born and raised in England, by the way, you can tell. Fantastic speaker, by the way, all things being equal. Shashi Tharoor is an incredible speaker, man. You know, I'm not saying that I agree with everything he says. And the thing with Shashi Tharoor is he agrees with Jeffrey Sachs about, spending too much money on the military. He agrees with Jeffrey Sachs about needing to spend more on vaccines, okay? But Shashi is not an American. So I can disagree with him, but his opinions and if his dishonesty about, for example, the opioid epidemic in the United States, he's allowed to. He's not American. He's not backstabbing me. He's a foreign person doing his foreign stuff. So, even though perhaps the organizations he's involved with have negative impacts on the United States and deaths of Americans, I feel very differently about it. It's very different. It's very different for that very specific reason. Now, he was a key person at the United Nations, this Shashi Tharoor. Yes, his book was published by Skyhorse. He wrote multiple books about India, about the future of India. He's very close with Kofi Annan, former head of the United Nations, since the 1980s, 1990s. I have no idea how big of a deal this Shashi Tharoor is. Interesting data point, okay, that when the first plane hit the tower in New York City on the morning of September 11th, 2001, Kofi Annan and Klaus Schwab were standing next to each other, getting out of a cab, ready to go into a meeting. That's a true story. I actually have the video. You can go into my shared archives. Klaus Schwab was standing next to Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan's good friend with Shashi Tharoor. Saw the first plane fly right in. Whoa! Look at that. And Shashi Tharoor, lots of commentary post 9/11. He also had a book published. And it's funny that Fareed said, you're also a writer, but we're not going to talk about that. Probably because one of his most popular books, called Riot, which was about a relationship of an American woman who went to India, who had some relationship with a Muslim or a Hindu. It's semi-fictional regarding conflict between Hindus and Muslims, was published September 10th, 2001. Precisely, you can't make this shit up, one day after Germs, Judith Miller, which was published September 9th, 2001. So I also found a video today of Shashi Tharoor. Oh, and remember, Shashi Tharoor, he's the most prominent Indian promoting and celebrating the new mayor of New York City, who is also Indian. He's not really Ugandan, he's Indian. And I found a video of him. Oh, yeah, he's also still sparring with Trump. He's sparring with Trump over serious disagreement about Trump's cutback on H-1B visas. So there's two other main names that have been complaining about the cutback in H-1B visas. Two, actually. One is Jeffrey Sachs. That's right. The other guy in this video here is still basically side by side with Shashi regarding screw America. Let's do what's good for India. And for Shashi, this is the thing I mentioned earlier. I would love to have a beer. I don't drink beer, okay? So, and now I can't even drink soda like I used to because I get heartburn. But if I went out to maybe, have a nice dinner, I would love to hang out with this guy. It's no hard feelings. I get it. He doesn't have a responsibility as a citizen of the United States to cooperate with me and look after my best interests. But Jeffrey Sachs does. Jeffrey Sachs is a traitorous, murdering backstabber. That said, Shashi went on to be very vocal about 9/11. But the video that I found, it was from, I think, October or November of 2001. And remember, he's a very powerful person at the United Nations at the time. He was commenting about how the United States was having good relations with Pakistan, especially going into 9/11, and about how this was potentially problematic towards advancing relations between United States and India. Now, why do I bring that up? I bring that up because note that many of the 9/11 researchers, which are all going to be sent out into the field soon, because it's clear that they've all failed their jobs, love to talk about PAC-ISI, Pakistani intelligence having some role in facilitating 9/11. That's interesting. It's almost as if India's role and interest in 9/11 and its response is starting to come out. Now, you haven't seen this before because we've all been misled for now at least 25 years to focus on one thing and one thing only, Israel. That's it. But Israel was tiny then, and Israel is tiny now. Israel is small budget then. Israel's small budget now. India was always big. Another person who has spoke out against Trump's decision regarding H-1B visas. Two people. One has been Richard Verma, again, non-American, born in Canada, maybe India, but Canada at least. Winburn Center, Soon Chung, Robert Malone, etc. Hillary Clinton, State Department, blah, 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 gefilte fish email. But also Raja Krishnamurthy, an Indian-born representative, government democratically elected representative, whatever that means, in Illinois, longtime friend of Barack Obama, and also friend of all of these people, and a friend of both Jeffrey Sachs and Shashi Tharoor. Now, there is an American who spoke out in favor of what President Trump did with respect to H-1B visas. And that person was Charlie Kirk. Charlie Kirk also spoke out against U.S. involvement in the conflict between Pakistan and India, a conflict that Shashi Tharoor, I believe, wants America to get involved in, a conflict that Raja Krishnamurthy, Illinois, wants the United States to get involved in. Isn't it interesting how all the fake lying citizen journalists, and the American-born ones are traitors to the United States of America, are all only talking Israel? But the biggest pile of money is India. And that's a video short in and of itself. Follow the money is what poly-truthy, I don't know, fringeless views, I don't know, fungus views, can't even think of her name, Amazing Polly, also misrepresenting the nature of the opioid epidemic in the United States, as well as clean use centers and everything else. The pile of money thing. How many say follow the money? Whitney Webb's follow the money, but only follow it up until a pile of money that they want you to look at, and then never look at another pile of money. Follow the money. Always follow the money. Just only follow it to this pile here. Don't look at the bigger mountain of money over there. Just follow it here, and then hopefully you'll never find Houstonic ITS, Houstonic.live, where they're going to talk about the real piles of money. And Max Boot. Now Max Boot, it has a bit of a semi-defenseless position there. If you really can save, like millions of lives, with a couple $100 million, how can you say no to that? All right. So he was definitely stumbling there. But Jeffrey Sachs here is, you could tell, it's mostly disgust. They're fighting over money. They're fighting over control of the U.S. military. The United Nations wants control over the United States military. The United Nations wanted, or whatever money forces was behind it, was to roll out experimental gene therapy in the form of an anthrax vaccine on the U.S. military. An anthrax vaccine where I think the plasmids were going to be made by Vical Corporation, V-I-C-A-L. Vical Corporation, which was started and run by an Indian man named
Vijay Samant, last name S-A-M-A-N-T.
I have it in my database somewhere. A technology that supposedly was spearheaded by Robert Malone, even though Robert Malone wasn't the primary name on the patent. Robert Malone, I think, is half Indian or something like that. Just look at Robert Malone. It's pretty clear he's not Scot-Irish. One of his key mentors, who was basically a Nobel Prize winner and won all kinds of decorations within the nation of India, and that is Inder Verma. Inder Verma studied under David Baltimore. Of course, Inder Verma was silenced over probably some stupid made-up charge about being mean to women or whatever, which I guess includes Robert Malone. And then, of course, all of the legal work that was being done at the Winburn Center was being overseen by the Indian Richard Verma. And the center was going to be run by a Nigerian immigrant that Robert Malone was tasked with training. Boy, that is an awful lot of non-American. Like, what, you can't find any Americans around here to do this type of work? Really? I'm all for bringing in the best of the best around the world. But at some point, I just think that you just don't want any Americans on this. Robert Malone is sort of an American, I guess, but again, willing to use the deaths of a drug epidemic for his benefit and lie about it, willing to work with Jessica Rose, who lies about it, willing to work with Pierre Corey with COVID-19, who lies about it, lying about why people die for money, lying about why people die, enabling mass murder. And we had mass murder during COVID-19, and no one's calling it out. So, all of this stuff, it's coming out right now. It's finally coming out. Just when I think I'm starting to figure it out, I missed the magnitude of the Indian government, UN government. I mean, he talks better King's English than King's. It's starting to be visible right now. I didn't really see this component. I didn't know that this went all the way back to 9/11. It's been there. I should have seen it. But now that I can see it. And remember, India is a British Crown territory, or it was. And Israel was also created by England. Wouldn't it make sense if the concept of Israel were to be used as a distraction to get the eyes off of India? So easy to say. Follow the money. Follow the population. Follow Houstonic.live.